Today, meetings were held around the possibility of the country introducing a permanent universal income grant. Some of the topics discussed include whether the country can really afford such a grant and where the funds would come from. Neil Coleman, co-director and senior policy specialist of the Institute for Economic Justice, he joins me now live. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Neil. So you kicked off the webinar. First of all, the question that was on the table today was, can we afford it? I'm asking you that question.
Yeah, Tony, and good evening to you and your listeners. The first question really that people are asking is, can we afford not to do it in the context of this massive crisis that we're facing? Universal basic income is becoming a very hot topic internationally, but in South Africa, where we have such high levels of poverty and hunger and unemployment, the issue is, can we afford not to do it? However, of course, people see this large price tag for something like this. You take a number of million South Africans. If it's universal, you say all adults between the ages of 18 and 59 receive it, although the more wealthy in our society pay it back. And then you multiply that by the cost of the grant, either somewhere between the food poverty line or the upper bound poverty line is the most common in the debates amongst policymakers at the moment. And you come up with a huge figure, and people become very alarmed by the amounts that are involved. But I think what people forget is that that is what really the gross cost. That's the nominal cost of rolling out a grant. And I think what researchers, including today at our webinar, are increasingly talking about is the fact that rolling out a grant like this has major multiplier effects, or it has major economic spin-offs, because as people receive the grant, they spend it in their communities, businesses spring up in order to service these people who have disposable income for the first time in their pockets. And we've seen with the various trials that have taken place in countries like Namibia, Kenya, et cetera, it's had this effect. So what you find is more employment, more businesses, greater revenue to the government, clawing back a lot of what is spent in the form of VAT, and so on and so forth. So the actual cost in the end, the financing requirement for a grant like this, is about half or less than half of what the gross or the nominal cost is once you've factored in all these economic spin-offs and benefits which accrue as a result of the pumping in of a stimulus into local economies which currently have very little income.
So that initial cost that you're talking about, where the figure being bandied around is 200 billion rand. And the people that will be worried about this are your taxpayers, your businesses and so forth, where a large majority of this money would obviously come from, as you said. You got Business Unity South Africa, they're against this particular idea. They're saying we must be able to find other ways, austerity measures, maybe public work schemes. What say you to that?
Well, I mean, it's a contradiction in terms, Tony, because if we've got an economy that is being suffocated by lack of economic activity and income, then the result of the austerity is to deepen that economic depression. So you need the opposite of that. You need the pumping of income into those communities. We've got the local government elections now. And really, if you look at communities around the country, what they are desperate for, of course, are jobs, but they're also desperate for income and improving their living standards. So the point about a basic income is it pumps income into communities very, very quickly, as we've seen with the COVID grant, which has rolled out around 8 million grants in the space of a few months. So you can do that very quickly with a grant. To do that through infrastructure, jobs, and other programs takes a much longer period of time. And therefore, while basic income is not a substitute for those, it is a very important bridge to stabilize communities and to begin to get the engines of the economy moving. So we believe that there are many in business who actually recognize this and support this. I mean, particularly since the destruction of the July looting and so on, 50 billion rand lost in 2 weeks is, puts it in perspective about the amount of resources that are at stake. We're not even talking about the wasted resources in terms of people not being able to be economically active because they are so desperate, because they lack any income to be able to run a small business, to get involved in economic activity, even to look for work. And the international experience shows that this basic income actually encourages people to get into the labor market, go to school, it improves people's health, and those sorts of things.
So Neil, who are the other participants in your webinar series, and what do you aim to achieve?
Well, what we're trying to do, Tony, is to look in some detail. It was launched today by the Department of Social Development, and we have various international and local experts looking at different elements or different dimensions of the debate. The first debate is affordability. The second debate is design. Should a basic grant be universal, or should it be targeted only to, for example, the unemployed? And there's strong views on either side of that. The Institute for Economic Justice has just put out a policy brief in which it looks at the international experience around design and concludes that a universal grant, for many, many reasons, is preferable. So we'll be discussing that. The third webinar will look at the impact of these grants in terms of development, in terms of poverty, in terms of inequality, employment and growth. And the fourth webinar will look at politically, how do we get there? How does civil society, together with policymakers, achieve a consensus? You spoke about business. Business needs to come to the party because they also need to recognize that if you have this disposable income in the hands of millions of people, that also helps to generate demand for locally produced goods and services. So there's a need for a national debate, and what we're trying to do is the IEJ, together with the HSRC and our partners in Pay the Grants, is to open up this debate as government begins to make some of these critical policy choices in the run-up to the termination of the COVID grant next year at the end of March, and hopefully a transition to a universal basic income guarantee.
All right, thank you so much. Neil Coleman, Co-Director and Senior Policy Specialist of the Institute for Economic Justice, talking to us about this webinar series on the question is, Universal Basic Income Guarantee, can South Africa afford it?